it's more than.
In France?
No, in Taiwan.
In Taiwan.
Right? Yes, through the introduction of Professor Rada, and then we had our biennial summer universities from Taiwan to Xi'an to Bordeaux, and Albania didn't come in Istanbul and so on, but she also has been visiting us off and on, and we kept contact with one another. And Professor Iveković-Europe, she was a former director of the International College of Philosophy in Paris. It's very well known.
I was just a program director among many.
Among many.
Okay.
But it's a group collaboration. And many very important scholars, philosophers taught there, and students from around the world. And also within the school or outside of the school, they come here to discuss philosophical issues. She was born in former Yugoslavia, right? And she had her doctorate degree in Buddhist studies from Delhi University. But after 1991, as we all know, there's a very serious civil war in former Yugoslavia, and she left. And I believe she experienced very painful period of time watching the country split, and citizens fought against one another, and they could report on someone who is anti-nationalist. So we know that in the 90s, we know that even though it's a post-Cold War and the borders seems to be erased, but the borders are actually very deeply rooted across the cities, across the nations. And nowadays, it's becoming a more visible issue. Okay. So there's also a crime in solidarity. Okay, that they have been. The NGOs have been criticizing, and also that is the thing we noticed from last time, the talk, right, that Balkan wrote, they criminalize those people who assisted those people who wanted to move across the border for safety, for all reasons. So there's inability to move, or the legalized penalty on this mobility, or those people who supported or assisted. This is some very difficult questions we are facing today, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, okay, or in different cities in a very much civilized society. We are watching these borders surfacing in different shapes. When she arrived in Paris, she started to teach and write and publish in French and English. Her most important works actually there's more than 15 books. Either she wrote or co-edited or co-written. One very interesting topic or important topic will be partition, reshaping states and minds, Rulage 2005. And another interesting co-edited volume, From Gender to Nation. And she has also been working on the issue of the politics of translation for a long time. Okay, so of course, when we say translation, we don't mean literal or linguistic translations, but translations across borders, translation in different forms. So that is something we could think along with her study and many other scholars. She actually, in recent years, has devoted very much on the issues of refugees or missing citizens or the invisible people in the city. So that would give us some clue to her mini course that she offers here with us. And the talk she's giving today, she also has been working together with many people. Some of them you know, for example, Central Masatra, Etienne Bolivar. Those are the art thinkers that we read in classroom and discussed together. We look at our Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia context and see how the historical processes formulate the contemporary order in these countries, okay, this part of the world. So let's join me and welcome her. And then give the mic to her.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyce, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure and an honor, and I actually love collaborating with you and with this center. It has always been a pleasure and really an important part of my international contacts have been here. Do I really need the microphone? Do we need the microphone? No? Okay. Yeah. Right, okay, because of the camera at least. So my idea was I will have a mini course, and my idea was to start with some facts and then to complicate those facts, especially for the students and with the students in the subsequent sessions, of which the first one will be after these first 2 hours. We should have 1 hour, the students and I together. You see, I come personally from a situation of discontinuity. I come from a war. I was reborn at 45 from a civil war, from which I stepped away. I moved to France when the war started in Yugoslavia. And I have learned many things from that event. One of the things is that discontinuities are extremely important, and then that you can learn a lot from discontinuities, from ruptures, from interruptions of whatever seemed to be the normal course of events, of whatever seemed to be the prevailing conditions, and usually also the hegemonic conditions, and so on. So discontinuities, non-linearities, and interruptions, I find out are useful as a life experience, but also they are far more promising for thinking, and maybe as concepts. Maybe we should work them out as concepts, and they are exciting also. Much more exciting than continuity, sitting in your own continuity. If one keeps to continuities, one is likely to keep in line with conventional power configurations, with established hegemony. On the other hand, discontinuities are thought-provoking, and they disclose not only the other side of the medal, but they disclose unexpected viewpoints and perspectives too. They uncover alternative histories. They uncover possible histories. They uncover unnecessary, so-called unnecessary or useless histories. They uncover deviant stories, subaltern and complementary unconventional stories. As you must know, and I'm aware that people know here too. Europe is no exception to the contemporary general closure of borders to people from the global south and from the east. But it is in Europe a particularly insidious situation, and we have a particularly insidious example of what is going on, and it is also part of what the 21st century practically worldwide looks like within the contemporary world configuration of powers. Although we have been hearing about a massive migration crisis in Europe, they tell you all the time that we are being invaded from the south and from the east. They talk about a massive migration of crisis. They even talk about the replacement of the populations, the replacement of the French population by, for example, Muslims. This is, of course, a constructed fixation. I would say that there is no crisis, no migration crisis, no crisis of migrants, of immigrants, but there is a profound crisis of welcoming, of hospitality, of receiving these people in Europe. These people of which Europe is historically, of whom Europe is historically responsible. Historically responsible also because of the colonial past. We share the colonial past that we share, but from opposite sides of the mirror. So migrants, passers-by who could hardly be said to be welcomed. Somehow hospitality evaporated, and they are parked in temporary and wild camps all over Europe. We don't know the numbers of those camps. They go by the hundreds. They face rejection, they face pushing back, refoulement. They face racism, violence of all sorts. This crisis of hospitality, this refusal to welcome them, refusal of elementary hospitality, is a corollary, of course, of a crisis in representation that we all are aware about, both representing oneself, Europeans to themselves, and representing the other. Meanwhile, migration as an issue has become widely politicized. In a way different than it had been during the Cold War, when the migrants were supposed to escape from communism and surrender to capitalism, and were welcomed in the West, in Europe. They were welcomed. At that time, during the Cold War in Europe, which is symbolized by the Berlin Wall, I don't know how many people are aware of the number of dead people who crossed that wall. 140. 140. 140 too many. But today we go by the thousands. We go by the thousands. In 20 years of the Berlin Wall, we had 140 people dying at that wall, and all of them have a name. All of them have a memorial. All are remembered. Today, we have thousands more. Most of them drowned in the Mediterranean Sea when crossing the sea to Europe. We don't know their names, we don't know their numbers. We have an estimate. Estimates are very high. Estimates are about 40,000 over the past 10 or 15 years, 40,000 compared to the 140 in 20 years. But it is impossible to count them because we only know those that have been identified. We don't know the numbers at departure. They're much higher. Probably the dead are many more. Now, migrations, as we all know, happen in all directions, and they happen mostly to neighboring regions and neighboring countries, which is something the still hegemonic West and North is happy to ignore. We don't get most of them into Europe, as we complain. But migrations usually occur from the brinks, from the fringes, and from the peripheries towards what are thought to be rich and hegemonic countries. And this is what I shall examine with an eye on Europe, and within the context of the now raising populisms, as well as, not uncommonly, of raising extreme right movements in Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe. Now, these three elements, migration, populism, extreme right, are related. Like in the USA, like in Australia, in Israel, in some Asian countries too, those migrations from the planet South and East are rejected. However, migrations as an ancient human way of being have always existed, but at this time, as an epochal and global issue, I feel they define the 21st century. They do so among other phenomena such as climate change, ecological catastrophes, as we know, predation, proxy wars, land grabbing, and rising populist nationalisms, coupled with staunch state sovereignisms, and so on, with cognitive and financial capitalism, neo-colonial inclinations, and so on. That is all the context, that and much more. We have neo-colonial inclinations, and we have even in Europe uninhibited fascism and Nazism, revivals of Nazism and forms of neo-fascism, because the anti-fascist legitimation with which Europe came out of World War II has been eroded. It is finished, it has declined. All of these define the latest turn of globalization as we know it. And in a globalized world, migrations too should be apprehended globally and should be apprehended as a transnational phenomenon. I should try to raise some philosophical questions regarding the functioning of exceptions, about immunization, about blind spots within a given political context, and some political questions regarding the responsibility of Europe in this. For example, the so-called transition. Transition which has hit hard many southern countries, but also many East European countries from the former Soviet bloc, and not only from Yugoslavia also. Transition which is, you know, the usual structural adjustment that is imposed on you by the monetary fund and so on, and which really drains countries. It is something that is going on and that probably partly produces this post-fascism that we phase. We have to address also the outreach of tolerance in capitalism, how far does tolerance go, as well as the role of historiography that has to be examined, and the role of compared political economy. The problem of sharing and spreading of historic responsibilities within within globalization arises, open to endless debates and controversial points of view. The problem with migrants and for migrants is that they end up being bereft of rights, of human rights, of citizenship rights. They are the exceptions in a given country where they end up because they are neither nationals nor citizens, and nationals are usually citizens. They are not sufficiently protected by any international or, for that matter, national legislation, which in the case of migrants at least doesn't work in spite of well-intentioned proclamations of powerless international organizations and so on. Migrants are out of scope. They are outside the scope. They are hors champ, out of the scope of perception. And they are out of the norm. They do not correspond to the norm. Slogans such as America First or protecting the European way of life, as we have heard lately in Europe, are clearly inimical, unfriendly to immigrants and not only to them. Yet these migrations are not likely to stop because they are part and parcel, as well as the result of the way our world, our economies, our international relations have been constructed. So migrations will go on. This is why the deaths at the borders, drowning at sea, crossing, and even the killings of migrants or letting them be killed, migrants who are criminalized and animalized, all of this doesn't represent a big issue for the partisans of the principles of America First or Europe First or whatever country first. The unwavering rejection of immigration by European countries, by most states to various degrees, but by big parts of the population too, of which many had until recently been emigration countries. Europe was an emigration place, an emigration continent. So this rejection of immigration comes within the context of worldwide populisms, of new, non-progressive, non-liberating and excessively sovereignist nationalisms, as well as of new forms of fascism around the world. The end of the Cold War did away with formerly understandable, albeit dichotomically constructed values and political language, leading to new Confucianism. Confucianism, the word comes from confusion and not from Confucius. Not Confucianism, but Confucianism. We have a lot of that in Europe. Political confusion. In the former Eastern Bloc, political Eastern Bloc in Europe, and some of those countries are within the European Union now, in Europe. In the former Eastern Bloc, that of countries around the former Soviet Union, there has been a social, political, and economic degradation which has brought some of them rather nearer to the third world, meanwhile, also due to the so-called transition. So they come nearer to the third world than to the first world, which also constructs a lot of resentment and which makes the population turn against immigrants. I have called the contemporary migrations epochal. They involve much suffering and too many deaths and imply delayed, interrupted, and ruined lives for individuals over months or years in cases of survival. Today in the Mediterranean, 1 of 14 individuals trying to cross it dies. 1 of 14 out of 14 dies. And they characterize an epoch, the historic period of the 21st century, and affect several generations. This epochal, ongoing, and unstoppable flow is characterized by the closure of state borders, such as is going on in Europe and elsewhere, within a general contemporary cosmopolitics of closure. A cosmopolitics of closure which corresponds to the limits of our planet. Our planet has attained its limits. People cannot emigrate anymore to continents to discover. It doesn't exist anymore. We have attained the limits of the planet, and we certainly have a regression with regard to historic periods or to ideals and ideologies of greater openness, of cosmopolitanism, of internationalism, and even of political multilateralism, regardless even of political regimes. So while we shall mainly address the sovereignty response and the dramatic border closure in Europe in the 21st century, it is clear that migrations probably involve even greater numbers, I don't know the numbers actually, in Asia at this time, also related to nationalisms and to maybe similar conditions. We know that Europe and Asia are communicating vessels, and there is some similarity in all this. Today, Europe is waging something that I do not hesitate to call a war on migrants. We have a war on migrants, a war. Many of the migrants trying to cross to Europe come from Asia, not all of them, many come from Africa. They come in the first place from the wars in Western Asia, but traditionally from the rest of the continent too, and they come from Africa too. Nobody can tell the exact number of deaths at the borders, and in particular in the Mediterranean. But much of it happens out of sight. And we don't have the numbers of departures. But according to the researcher Claude Calame, a rough estimate is that about 40,000 people disappeared in the Mediterranean since 2000, since the year 2000. 40,000 disappeared since the year 2000. 40,000 that we know of. And there are all those that we don't know of. The ways states, both in Europe as well as in Asia, now react to subsequent waves of immigrants is pretty much the same, I suppose, or similar. Namely, we try to export borders. We export borders to neighboring countries who do the dirty business for us. We try to contain immigration. We refine programs of chosen immigration in relation with